In this video, I'm going to share with you how I usually mix watercolor paints into the jars in preparation for my watercolor painting classes. Many people find that this is a very perplexing process because there really isn't any exact measurement or proportion that is used. And so I want to show you how I find exactly the correct proportion. And it is through a process of working through it and being able to identify what's going to work for you and for your students. As a general rule, I use this idea for the amount of color. In grades 1 and 2, it's really important that the paint is very uniform, and therefore it has to be fairly vibrant and contain a lot of the color in the mixture. But I don't want it to be too thick in order that the children won't have any transparency or fluency in the paint mixture. In grades 3 to 5, I have often kept the paints in the little jars and allowed it to have a sediment at the bottom so that the children, when they dip their brush deeper into the jar, they're able to grab hold of a pigment that is less diluted. In my class, we call those the goodies. So let's take a moment to just try the dilution process. I'm going to take my jar and I'm going to use this Stockmar, which comes in the small jars of 20 milliliters for home use, and can come in these 250 milliliter jars for classroom use, which is what I usually buy every year. And I'm going to put a small amount in here. Red tends to be fairly sticky, so I need a little help with a brush. And I'm going to put enough really to create a thin layer on the bottom of the jar. Like so. A little more on my brush here. I'll just clean that up so I don't have too much. And I'm going to add some water, about a half a jar full of water. Half a jar. Let's put a little bit more. I'm going to mix it carefully so I don't splash. Making sure that all the thickened solution, the thickened, base color is diluted and mixed in. Still have some concentrated bits here and there. Because I'm stirring all the way down to the bottom, this is what I'm going to call a uniform mixture. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to test it. I always test it on a piece of paper. To me, that's not quite strong enough. Again, working hard to mix it in so it's all dissolved within the mixture. Now, my opinion is one opinion. You ask your colleagues and they're going to have different opinions about how this is mixed together. That's the wonderful thing about art, is that nobody ever does it exactly the same way. you'll find through trial and error that this work will become easier to do here. So you can see the difference now. I can still see the paper through the color. It's very strong, but not too strong, because it doesn't create any opacity that cannot be broken up. And then if I were to work with this paint in my paintings, I also have the ability to add water and stretch it out a little bit to a lighter red. So I would say that that consistency is just right for me. I'll close up my container, and I will use in the second jar this stone. This comes from Paper Scissors Stone. It's quite a nice color. It's a little different. These colors are a little bit less expensive than the Stockmar colors, and they are also made in the United States. So if you and your school have some interest in supporting American companies, this is a very nice paint. Again, the red is very sticky. I need a little help. So that looks like a nice amount. A little more. So just creating a little bit of an amount on the bottom of the jar and adding some water. Now, if you're thinking about, boy, this would be very labor intensive for me to make all of these jars for my students. Yes, that is true if you follow this process for each of the jars. But I will jump quickly to the next step. As soon as I test this one, sure I have all the concentrated. So here is my new color. This is the stone color. Here is a little bit more magenta than the Stockmar red, but that's okay. But it's not quite strong enough. So I'm going to add a little bit more. It's actually quite a bit more. Might end up having to put some water in here. That's quite nice. There. You can see the opacity is a little bit strong, but not too much. It doesn't have a sticky feeling or pasty. It's really quite nice. And then when I add a little water to it, it lightens it up nicely. So that's a good consistency. This is what you're looking for, this kind of consistency. And that would be found in this uniform mix. For grades 1 and 2, I create the uniform mix, and if I'm working with a whole class, I will make a jar full, probably filling enough up to here, which means that you probably would need anywhere from 7 to 9 teaspoons of strengthened of the concentrated mix that you would put in first, and then you would add water, a little bit of water at first, and stir it up, and then add some more water and stir it to complete uniformity. If you're making the jars for grades 3 and 5, what you would do is create the uniform mix, and then at the bottom of the jar you would put a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of your concentrated mix right in the bottom of the glass jar, and then pour the uniform mix on top of it, so that as the paint settles, there will be a nice layer of sediment at the bottom. The color at the top will become lighter, so that the students have the ability to either mix up the color by putting the lid in, mixing it up, and pulling some of that sediment into the uniform mix, or just leave it the way it is after settling, and the surface paint will have less pigment in it, and as they go deeper into the jar, it will have more pigment in it. So these kinds of considerations are really important for how you're going to teach your students to work. So to review, when working with a classroom, I would mix a full jar of uniform solution. You can then lay out all the jars for the students' sets and pour the uniform mix into each jar. So if you have, say, 12 jars for a class of 24 students, you would make enough for those 12 jars, and you would pour about a half a jar of color into each jar. At the end of the class, the children would take their jar full of paint and they would come and pour it back into the mother solution so that these jars could then be cleaned. Then the mother solution will sit and will wait for you for the next week. And before the lesson, you would take the time to mix this up and consider it using your testing to see if it's still the correct consistency and the correct strength. Make any modifications you need to, and then you would pour them into the clean jars. If you are interested in having this sediment mix, oftentimes you would not be pouring the jar out of the smaller jars into the bigger jar, but you would leave each set of paints would remain sitting in the small jars with the lids on for the course of the week. And then as the paint settles, it will create this sediment layer at the bottom. If a child's paint level goes down and it becomes too strong for them, you can have a jar of the uniform mix on the side ready for them in case they need to refill their jar about halfway with the uniform mix. Some teachers I know have created their mixes in a bottle that has this wonderful squeeze top. So they have the uniform mix ready and on the side of the counter, so that if their student during the middle of lesson, rather than needing you to help pour it into the jar, they can carefully pour the liquid into their jar without creating a mess. So this is a squeeze top bottle filled with uniform liquid. So this is the basic idea of how to mix the concentrated paints into your small painting jars. Again, I want to share that every teacher approaches this a little differently. depending on your classroom setup, depending on the time that you have to set up for your painting lessons, depending on the supplies that you have. All these kinds of things can alter and modify your approach to mixing and preparing paints for the students. I encourage you to make comments in the discussion below and let me know if you have used some other methods that you have found successful that you would like to share with other Waldorf teachers who are learning this process. I wish you all the best and happy painting.